thanks everybody for getting on Zoom and getting ready for this class. I'm very excited personally to have our guest today because he is someone that not only have I been a colleague with, but, and I'm sure, Marty, you've heard this many times, I grew up listening to you.
Yeah, I've had a lot of people say that. I've put more people to sleep at night than anybody I know.
But it's very true. I mean, being a Reds fan, growing up as a Reds fan, I was one of those nerds that had the little red Zenith transistor and I put it under my pillow and I would listen to Reds games and I would carry it around on Saturday afternoons in the grocery store and people would come up to me and say, "What's the score? What's the score?" Because everybody wanted to know what was going on with the Reds. But we are so lucky and very fortunate to have Marty Brennaman with us, Hall of Famer. His path is one that we have talked about in class about how you get your experience. Most of the time you start in a small market and work your way up. And that's certainly what Marty has done. And I'll let him talk about it. But when he got his big break with the Reds, he followed Al Michaels. So think about that, you know, moving into that booth with established color analyst and, you know, beloved established co-analyst with the Reds. But Marty, I will turn it over to you. Let you talk a little bit about your background, how you got that experience and how you got your big break. And then we'll open it up to questions and see what some of the students want to know a little bit more about your experience and, you know, just some advice on how they can get that. So Marty, I'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, thank you very much, Betsy. I was born and raised in Portsmouth, Virginia, and went to school all through my high school years, and then went to a small boys' school in Ashland, Virginia, which is north of Richmond, Randolph-Macon College. And quite honestly, the only reason I went there, not putting it down at all, was because I couldn't get into where I wanted to go and where I eventually ended up. And that's the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I knew I wanted to major in communications. And so I went to Randolph-Macon, then transferred to Chapel Hill, got my degree in radio, television, and motion pictures is what it was called back then. Now today they simplify it by saying communications. And I had a pretty good idea that I wanted to be a play-by-play guy. I didn't want to be a guy that sat in a television studio and was given 3.5 minutes at 6 and 11 o'clock every night to report on what was going on in the world of sports. I wanted to be a play-by-play guy. I was so impacted by listening to certain broadcasters in the decade of the 50s as I was coming up, guys that obviously are long gone now. Most of them are not even with us anymore, but I was enthralled by listening to a big league baseball game and wondering what the ballpark looked like and the whole 9 yards. It makes baseball so captivating, quite honestly, even more so on radio than it is on television, I think, because then your imagination takes over. I think if there's one sport that was made for radio, it was baseball. And so long story short, I got out of Carolina, got a job at a small 1,000-watt radio station in Salisbury, North Carolina. I did American Legion baseball, which is down in the Carolinas, and Virginia is just a hotbed in the southeastern part of the United States. Some Legion teams can play up to 55 games, 60 games a summer. And I did those for 3 years, along with small college football and basketball and high school football and basketball. Got out of school, could not find when I went to, I couldn't find the job that I wanted. And so I had to take what I could get, because by the time I graduated, I was married and had 2 kids. Both of my kids were born in Chapel Hill, and had my first 2 kids. And then time went by, and all of a sudden, I got an opportunity to go back to my home area and in the Tidewater area of Virginia, Portsmouth, Norfolk, Virginia Beach. Because a professional basketball team was coming out of Washington, D.C., the Virginia Squires, and they were looking for a local guy to do their games. And so I was contacted and did that for three and a half seasons, and also did AAA baseball in Norfolk. Back then, the team was a New York Mets farm club, and I did their games for 3 years. And all of a sudden, Al Michaels, thank God, decided to leave Cincinnati and go to San Francisco. And the general manager of the club that I worked for in Norfolk, Dave Rosenfield, God bless his soul, ran into Dick Wagner, who was a Reds assistant general manager at the baseball winter meetings in Houston, Texas. And in the course of the conversation, uh, Dick Wagner said, "We've lost our number one guy, and we're looking for somebody." And Dave Rosenfield said, well, "I got a guy who does my game, who does a pretty good job." And he said, "Well, tell him to send me a tape." And so I did that. Time went by. This was in the fall and early winter months of 73 going into 74. I get a call one day after having some communication back and forth with them. And they called me one day and said, "We have narrowed the list down to 3 people, and we want to bring you to Cincinnati for an interview." So I had to do a game in Indianapolis, the Squires and the Pacers. And so I came into Cincinnati, met with the people who made the decisions over a 2-day period. Then they said to me on the second day I was in and the day I was leaving to go to Indianapolis, "We haven't quite made up our mind yet. You go back to your hotel, get your stuff together, and we'll be in touch." I said, "Okay," because quite honestly, it was a good deal then, but still I was so enamored with professional basketball. So I go back to the hotel, and within 10 minutes of me getting back to the hotel, I get a call, and it was the general manager of the Reds, and he said, "We've changed our minds. We're going to bring you back to the ballpark and make you an offer. We want you to be the new voice of the Reds." So I went back there. They made the pitch. It was a 3-year deal, but it was actually only 1 year because they had club option after the first year. If they didn't like my work, they could get rid of me after 1 season. Went back to Virginia Beach, talked to my wife. She was in favor of it. And here we are 50 years later. I was very fortunate to have people that thought enough of my work to go out on a limb and recommend me. There are a lot of guys that won't personally give you a recommendation unless they are convinced that you have the ability to do whatever job you have an opportunity to get. Because if they make enough recommendations that are not good, then the people that respect them to give them a straight up answer to their question, they won't get any calls anymore. So, and Dave Rosenfield was like that. Had he not felt like I could do the job, he would have never recommended me to come to Cincinnati. Greatest thing that ever happened to me for a guy who was born and raised in the South, and going to the Midwest for the first time ever to work. I was blessed because it's a great city. I had a ton of opportunities to leave there from San Francisco to the Yankees, to the White Sox, to the Cubs, to the Boston Red Sox. And every time I had to make a decision, it was always, I like it where I am. And I've never second guessed the decision at any point in my now 50 years, 46 on the radio. So I was fortunate. It doesn't happen that easy because I only basically worked in the minor leagues for 3 seasons, and now I'm in the big leagues. And so I thank God every day that it happened in the manner in which it did, and I had the people who were behind me and wanted to see me advance my vocation at the biggest level that there is in baseball. And so my deal's a storybook deal because it was so good for me, and every decision I felt like I had to make along the way was always the right decision.
And as you made those decisions, and I just want to remind everybody to make sure you're on mute because we'll be asking questions back and forth. When you made that decision at the very beginning, I'm going to do play-by-play, was it because you were a basketball fan, baseball fan? Was it because that this was something that you watched some of the
Right.
other broadcasters and thought, man, that'll be cool? I mean, what made you make that decision so early in your career?
Well, I tell you, that's a good question, Betsy, because I mentioned earlier I'd listened to broadcasters at night when I was growing up in the 50s. I listened to Chuck Thompson at Baltimore. I listened to Bob Prince in Pittsburgh. And I was just enthralled by the whole thing. I don't know that I say at that point I was probably a bigger baseball fan than I was anything else. But then later on, when I started professionally, I got wrapped up in basketball at one point more so than baseball. But going back to my listening habits, I listened to a guy one night who was broadcasting a Brooklyn Dodgers baseball game. And I was just so taken by his presentation, his comments about the ballparks. And I mean, my imagination just ran away from me. His name was Nat Albright. I found out 2 or 3 years after the fact that he was recreating Brooklyn Dodger baseball games from a studio in Arlington, Virginia. I went back and did some research when I found I had no damn idea what a recreation was. That didn't go with what I got up here. And he'd gone to Walter O'Malley, who was the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and said, "This is what I want to do. I want to pump these games into radio stations in small markets and large markets throughout the Southeast." And O'Malley thought it was a great idea because it was an area of the country that they had no presence in. Because, of course, by then, Ben was doing the LA Dodger games, and but that was to the Dodger network in California and Arizona and wherever else they might go. And I think that when I listened to him, Nat Albright, and I'm looking at a picture in my baseball room right now of him because it's very prominent. I think a subconscious light went on and made me realize that this is what I wanted to do with my life. And years later, when I went into when I was elected into the baseball broadcasters wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame, and that was 24 years ago, 2000, I found out he was still alive and still living in Northern Virginia. And I got a hold of his phone number and called him. And when he answered the phone, I said, "Mr. Albright, my name is Marty Brennaman." He knew who I was. He didn't know why the heck I was calling him, but he knew who I was. And I said, "I just wanted to let you know a couple of things. One, I've been elected into the broadcasters wing of the Hall of Fame. And secondly, I don't know that it would have ever happened had it not been for you." And I explained what I did. And I said, I would have not fulfilled my life's work had I not contacted you and told you how much of an impact you made on my career. And he broke down and cried on the phone. And 6 months later, he died. And so I did. It's not one of those things where you say to yourself, "God, I should have done it and didn't do it." And so it made me feel good that it meant something to him that I took the time to call him. And I think from that point on, that either further made me feel like play-by-play was the way I needed to go. Now, originally, way back, before I ever came upon that, I wanted to be a professional actor. I did a lot of theater work, did summer stock work in high school in my first year in college. Wanted to go to New York and break into professional theater. My mom and dad put me in touch with a couple of guys that were working off Broadway, and they were starving to death. And I realized, no pun intended, I didn't have the stomach for that. And so then this is way back. This is back probably in 1955, something like that. And I feel like I kind of made the right decision. I don't know whether I would have been as successful as a live actor in live theater, but I think that really helped me some in terms of doing what I eventually settled on doing.
Yeah. And I mentioned earlier about you joined in the booth, a beloved figure here in Cincinnati, someone who had been established broadcasting, Joe Nuxall. He's kind of a mythical figure in Reds history because he was the youngest pitcher ever to pitch in the major leagues. And he just had always been connected with the Reds. So he's established, he's this beloved figure here in town. And here you come to share the booth with him. We know that your friendship just, transcended the years, but walking in there, what did it feel like to share the booth with someone established like that, like a Joe Nuxall?
Well, that the impression that I got took place over time. I knew who Joe Nuxall was. I mean, the first thing I ever said to him when we met on February 1st, 1974, in a photography studio in Dayton, Ohio, was, "I have your baseball card." And I did. I was thrilled because I had all these cards. I was a kid who collected, And I knew who he was. I knew the success, had no idea how big he was from a love perspective in this town. They talk about Pete Rose and they talk about Oscar Robertson, even though he wasn't from Cincinnati, he was from Indianapolis. He went to play at UC, and those two guys were revered, and they should be. But there's never been a bigger sports figure in this town that Joe Nuxhall was, and thank God, getting the job when I did and having the opportunity to work with him and learn from him. And the longer we went, the closer we got. Probably the thing that drew us closer together was when I decided to take up golf. And from that point on, we were really joined at the hip, in the booth and out of the booth. And he was just a very special person. And of all the good things that have happened to me in my business, probably the thing I'm most proud of is the fact that he and I were together on the radio for 31 years. And the only other tandem that did Major League Baseball as long as that, they did 31 years together also. And I was Vin Scully and Jerry Doggett with the LA Dodgers. And if your name can be mentioned in whatever manner alongside of Vin Scully's name, then you're doing okay, because he's the greatest baseball broadcaster who ever lived. So the fact that I worked with Joe and the fact that he liked me, he could have made things tough for me in this town had he wanted to, but he didn't have inside. His heart would never allow him to do that to anybody. But guys like Joe and Sparky Anderson when I came, and Pete and Johnny Bench and Tony Perez and David Concepcion, all those guys that made up what we have come to know about the Big Red Machine, they bent over backwards. And it wasn't out of a sense of, we think we got a guy that's really nice here because Al Michaels was a jerk. That was not the case at all. Al was loved by these guys. He's become a friend of mine over the years, and they just felt like they would do whatever they could for me, because if they made me look good, then the whole ball club looked good, because I was their front man on radio and along with Joe. So Joe was really special. Never saw him in a negative situation with a fan. People would come up to him in restaurants in the middle of his dinner and ask him for autographs and pictures, and he would put all his knife and fork aside and pose for pictures, signed autographs. I just learned an awful lot about how you deal with the public in a position that makes you so popular, which he was in this town. I mean, as you said, he was born and raised here in Cincinnati, in Hamilton, Ohio, a suburb of Cincinnati. And he came back home when his career was over as a player. They put him in the broadcast booth, and he took to it like a duck takes to water.
That he did. You retired in 1999, right before COVID.
Yes.
2019. Good timing on your part to begin with. But the way that broadcasting has changed from the time that you have started to now, there's streaming, there's this, there's that, there's social, there's so many platforms that teams use to promote their team, to promote their players. But also it puts so much more pressure on the people who represent those teams, like their play-by-play, like their color, like sidelines. Tell us what you have seen over the years, how this business has changed since you first got into it.
Well, I think the biggest change is something that it doesn't translate to what we see on the field. I think social media has been the biggest single change. And that's probably unfair to say in our business, because social media has changed everybody's business. But I think that has really been a major form of consideration when you're talking about the business, but actually on the field and in the booth and the whole 9 yards. It's opened up so many opportunities for people who are interested in getting in the business. I know when I first came here, I think the Reds televised, 20 games, 25 games. And we all know now there hardly is a team in which every one of their games is not broadcast, or if they are, it's because they are conflicting with the network telecast, and the local has to, as you well know, back off. And in opening up opportunities for young people to get into this business in whatever form it might be, whether it's play-by-play, whether it's production, working in the truck and outside the truck in television. And it's given, the other part of it is given women a bigger presence in our business, which I think is great. I mean, who the hell said we should be doing it all and exclusive of all the females? And you're as good an example as there's ever been. I mean, you had an incredible career that a lot of people don't even know about. I'm old enough to remember, so I know from day one. So I think that's probably the biggest single thing, and it all has to do basically not so much with radio, but television. When TV exploded, when ESPN came into existence, everything then started. It was like a set of dominoes. It just fall by the wayside. Ball clubs in a local situation opened up their network. I mean, like I know the Reds right now, John Sadak and Chris Welsh and Barry Larkin and all those folks. They do almost every single game. There may be 8 games, something like that, 9 games, 10 games, but every club is doing that now. And that's at every level, not just baseball, football, basketball, the whole 9 yards, the National Hockey League. And I think that's a good thing, that because, the mere fact that you're involved in a communications class there in South Bend, these kids come in and deal with people like me and about the business. You didn't have a whole lot of that. When I got out of Carolina, they had a great school. And even back then, Syracuse had a tremendous school. And a lot of the West Coast cities, UCLA, Southern California, they had good communications department. There are good communications departments all over the United States. That's not just a handful. And I think that situation reflects how this business has just exploded. And people say, well, they've done as far as all they can do. It's not, nothing else is going, well, I don't know about that. Somebody's going to come up with something that's going to make this business even more attractive for young people who aspire to be in this industry, no matter what their interest is, whether it's a broadcaster, as I said earlier, as a production person, as a director, whatever the case might be. And that's a great thing. I think our business right now is thriving unlike it's ever thrived before.
Mm. And so many opportunities now are available while you're still in school. And I think that's something that, I wish that I would have had more opportunities while
Yes.
you're in school, because you get to try different things. And if you don't like this, no big deal. You just go to something else. So that's one advantage that students have now, that they can try different things while they're still in school
Sure.
and figure it out.
Absolutely.
So I want to open it up for questions. See if anybody's
Okay.
got a question real quick. Jake, I knew you would be the first.
Thank you so much for sitting down with us. Your career is a large majority in baseball, and what makes baseball so interesting is the conversational aspect. How are you able, what would be your advice to allow that conversation to flow within the broadcast while still having the heart of the play-by-play and the action be there, a part of the conversation?
That's a good question, Jake. I think if you're working with somebody else, and if unfortunately, if you're going to get a job in all likelihood in the minor leagues, if you want to concentrate on baseball, and on a local basis like that, most of those stations or clubs, if you're employed by the ball club, can't afford to have put 2 guys in there. So more often than not, you're going to be working by yourself, and that makes it really tough. You have to generate some measure of conversation, even though you're not doing it to somebody sitting next to you who can respond to anything you say. I see all too often, and I understand it. I'm not offering this up as a criticism, but more often than not, when a club brings a young guy out of the minor leagues, and we did that, the Reds did that. I don't know. My last year was, as Betsy said, was 2019. Tommy Thrall, who had worked in our minor league system for a number of years, got the job. There's a tendency to talk too much, but that's born out of the fact that you've worked by yourself for the most part. You don't have anybody to talk to. I think that's a thing that young guys coming out of the minor leagues to get a big league job have to be cognizant of, because now you don't have to do it all yourself. You've got a guy sitting there next to you, and more often than not, your guy sitting there next to you is a guy who knows more about the game than you do. because he played the game most situations. It's something that you have to work at, but at the same time, you have to realize that you're not the Lone Ranger anymore when you get to the big leagues, unless you're lucky enough to have someone work with you at the job that you had in the minor leagues. But I think that once you get to the big leagues, then you develop a relationship with the guy you work with. And that's very important. I'm not going to mention any names, but I know of situations, I know of a couple today, that guys get up in the morning and go to work and they don't like each other. Now, that's a hell on earth if you're doing big league baseball and you got to do 162 games and you go to work every day you play and you don't like the guy sitting next to you. That's why I said earlier, I was blessed because Joe and I had a great relationship. And I would have to say that we were a little different, our broadcast, because we would talk about things that had nothing to do with baseball. We would talk about Joe's golf game before I took the game up. We talked about my tomato plants. We had an Elvis Presley deal in our radio booth that CNN used as bumper video when they were going to a commercial. It was so cool. It was nothing that we sat down one day and talked about. We said, let's do this because maybe the fans will like this. This is a very provincial town, Cincinnati is. It's not New York. It's not LA. It's not Chicago. And so the things that we talked about certainly humanized ourselves to the people who turn the radio on every night. And it was good for us because people realized what kind of relationship we have. And out of that came topics that I don't know what they would be right off the top of my head, but we didn't make people feel that baseball and a game that night, if they win, it's tantamount to a multitude of changes in the history of the United States because the Cincinnati Reds won a game tonight. I think we did it, promoted it, and came at people in such a way that we wanted the club to win. But we also knew that it wasn't the end of the world if they didn't, that there were more important things in this world than whether the Cincinnati Reds beat the Philadelphia Phillies at Great American Ballpark tonight. So I think it's something you have to work at. And again, you have to be blessed if you're thrown together when you get to the big leagues. And I know you've got a pretty good start. Cape Cod League ain't too bad, is it?
No, it's not. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome.
Any other questions? We got a couple of Cincinnati girls in class as well. Anybody got a question? Yeah, and there's one right there, Maria.
I was just going to say, I'm a Cincinnati native, so I just wanted to thank you for all of your work in Cincinnati. I grew up listening, and yeah, my family moved to Cincinnati just when I was born, so it was a big part of my childhood to come to the Reds games and listen, of course, when we were driving through and couldn't make it to the games.
Maria, let me ask you a question. And this is something else I learned about living in the city of Cincinnati after I came here in '74. When two people are thrust together like you and I are, and one of the first questions that somebody asked a person like you, or you could have asked you, you knew I wasn't from here, but that is, where'd you go to high school?
I went to Ursuline Academy.
Oh, you did? Okay, very good.
Yep, so all girls school.
Oh yeah, I know exactly where it is. Yeah. Oh, that's good. That's good. Is your family still in Cincinnati?
Yes, everyone's still in Cincinnati right now. My dad used to run AK Steel up in Middletown, Ohio. He recently retired a few years ago, but he's still there. Can't seem to shake the Midwest connection. They're officially empty nesters. My sister is now a freshman here. So
that's great.
They'll be, domiciling to Florida, somewhere nice and warm where I can go visit. But no, they love Cincinnati and I love to call it home.
That's great. Good luck to you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anybody else with questions? Who's got a question? If I don't see you, go ahead and start talking. Anybody with question? Yeah, go ahead, Jake.
I'll go again if possible.
Okay.
Go ahead, Jake.
You talk about ultimately, baseball is so interesting in the series aspect. Can you take us through the prep day-to-day you have? Because baseball is unlike any other sport, and the fact that you've seen them play the night before, you're going to see them tomorrow. What is that prep day in and day out like? Is it more of the conversations with the players you felt later in your career, or still harping on a little bit of those numbers?
Again, that you touch on a good subject, because I can remember when I came, and I can remember when I did a lot of college basketball back in the 80s and the 90s, including the NCAA tournament on the network, national network. Back in those days, without social media, and when I found out what regional I would do for basketball, and this holds true to some extent in baseball too, I would find out on a Sunday where I'd be the next weekend. And the first thing I did was contact the sports information directors of all 4 of the college that would be represented in whatever the regional was. And they would overnight stuff to me. You don't have to do that anymore. I mean, it's so easy to become knowledgeable about the teams that you work for, work with. And the other point you made was the everyday aspect of the game of baseball. The biggest thing we did, and I really did a lot of homework as far as a season is concerned, was to go to spring training every year. And I'd go and we'd broadcast every single game. But you're there to look at you're there to look at the newcomers to your club, young guys coming out of the system. You're looking at players that are going to be newcomers from other teams. So you do a lot of homework in spring training. But once the season begins, again, the ease in which you can glean information, all you got to do is go on the Philadelphia website, and you can read about every player and what they're doing, even before you're being given every night a set of notes from the Reds and a set of notes from whoever they're playing. And you really pay attention to that. But at the same time, a lot of that stuff before you even get there, if you're doing any homework at home before a game tonight or a game tomorrow or whatever the case is. So I think it's really easier today. Anybody who goes on the air and they're not prepared, then they ain't doing their homework. That it's as simple as that. And I think that's another thing. I think fans, if they're going to listen to you broadcast baseball, they're not going to listen to you if they don't like baseball to begin with. So they have some knowledge about the game. Oftentimes, I've found over the years that there were people listening to us that knew more about it than I did. And so you have to be aware of that. And I think doing your homework is absolutely, without any question, an aspect of this prep that you want to be good enough at to get to a big league job one day. You got to do your work. You got to do your homework. You can't walk into a booth and make people think because sooner or later you're going to say something, or you're not going to say something that they're anticipating that'll let them know. Whoops. Everything collapsed. All right, there you are. Are you there?
Yep.
Okay.
We are here. Here we go.
I'm good. Everything collapsed on me, Betsy.
It happens.
So Jake, I think that really, and I'm sure that you've already found out a lot of the things. There's not a whole lot of things I can tell you that you don't already know, having been in the business. As Betsy mentioned earlier, there's so many great opportunities for people like you before you even graduate from Notre Dame. And so you've been down that road and you've walked the walk, and you will continue to do that. And hopefully one day you'll have a big league job and you'll talk to youngsters in college campus somewhere in the United States like I'm doing today.
We'll let you get the camera all settled. And I want to follow up with a little bit what you talked about earlier about there's 162 games plus if you're in the playoffs. And when you started, TV people only did a handful of games.
Right.
But then, TBS came along and WGN came along. And so now all those games are on. And so now the television people got to be part of that 162 game grind. And it looks very glamorous, but I want you to touch on just what that was like. Constant travel, you're away from home half the season. And again, if you're lucky, you get into the playoffs, and you did all of those games until, just a handful of years before you retired. Then you would take some nights off and go to Riverbend and go to concerts and things like that. But you did the 162 games. So What kind of a grind was that? What kind of a schedule was that for you personally?
Well, I don't know that I'm the right person to talk about it because I loved it. You know, we took commercial flights so many years. I'm stunned in looking back upon that part of my career with the Reds that there weren't situations that cropped up with mechanical problems on a commercial jet, and we did not make a game because of whatever the circumstance was. And then for the most of it, we chartered everywhere. And then my wife Amanda, anytime I complained about something at the airport, she said, "Just shut up. You're spoiled. Yeah, all you did was get on a bus to the ballpark, go to the airport, right out on the tarmac. They open the door, you get off, you go up the steps, and you find your seat." So she said, "I'm not interested in hearing what your complaint is about flying." And she was right. I was spoiled. Um, I found that the toughest part, even when I was a young man, was not flying to the West Coast, but flying back from the West Coast. I had a problem with that, but not a major problem. The older I got, I really got tired of traveling. But it was a psychological situation. It was a mental situation with me. And really, as the season progressed, I had a pretty acute understanding among neighbors that I lived at the 4 or 5 different places I've lived in Cincinnati. I'll talk to you about baseball and about the Reds all you want, but I prefer to do it out of season rather than in season because I get enough of it. And they were good about that, unless it was something really big that broke from the club and people were talking about it. I love the cities we went to. I've often maintained that among the 2 leagues, we have better cities than the American League does, with a couple of exceptions. I love to go to restaurants, and Joe and hung out a lot, and Pete and Joe Morgan and I did back in the day. But I think most guys that you talk to, if you're talking to broadcasters like me with other professional teams, they would probably say the same thing. Although, as I said, the older I got, I really got tired of the travel. And I had an occasion to talk to John Sterling on the phone 3 days ago, who just announced his retirement as a longtime voice, along with Susie Wallman for the New York Yankees. And I think John, who is older than I am, he's 85 years old. I think John got tired. And I think that's what happens more than anything, that the older you get, you have trouble bouncing back after arriving back at your home base at 1:30 or 2 o'clock in the morning, and then having trouble getting to sleep after you get home. But by and large, our travel is a whole lot better than the NBA. It's a whole lot better than the National Hockey League, because when we get to a hotel or a city, we have a chance to unpack our suitcase because we're going to be around for 2 or 3 or 4 nights, whatever the case might be. So I think baseball travel is a little bit better than it is in the other sports.
You mentioned John Sterling and people like a Chick Hearn, a Vin Scully, and I could go on and on. When they got those jobs, they didn't leave. I mean, they were there for decades and decades. Same thing with you. Once you got that job, even though you had an opportunity, you didn't leave. Even though there is a grind and even though there is travel, it's still a job that so many people want. What's the allure? What kept you in the business for that long?
Well, it was everything I thought it would be. When I got the chance to go to the big leagues, there was nothing that was thrown at me that made me sit back and say, "Well, wait a minute now. I had no idea this was going to be the way it is." And I'm a little less enthralled by being a big league baseball broadcaster. I was fortunate because I came to a team that was on the verge of exploding, and in retrospect is considered one of the great teams in the history of baseball. So it's kind of easy to go to the ballpark and broadcast a winner every night. That makes it really easy. And I'll never forget years later, Ben Scully, and who I looked upon in many respects as a mentor. Anytime I had a question that I felt was big, I would call and talk to Benny about it. And he said to me one day, I said, "How do you broadcast for a bad team? For a team that more often than not is going to lose, because now I came in 74. I didn't have a first losing season until I think 1982. So I had a pretty good run. And I asked him one day when the Reds were playing the Dodgers, I said, how do you broadcast for a losing team? He said, well, first off, in typical Scully fashion, he said, I pray that you never have to deal with that. But if you're around long enough, you're going to. I said, okay. He said, you have to take each game as a season unto itself. You can't say, if the Reds beat the Dodgers tonight, they will knock a game off the whoever was in first place in your division, and rather than being 12 and a half games out behind, you'll be only 11 if they get beat tonight. And that people can't relate to that. They're not interested in hearing about you being 12 or 13 games out of first place. If you win tonight, they lose. He said you have to approach he said inevitably you're going to have players that no matter how bad the team is, you're going to have two or three guys that are having pretty good years, and you have to accentuate the positive. He said, quite honestly, you don't have to work real hard for a really good team, but for a really bad team, you've got to work your butt off to make it interesting for people. And I found that to be the case. That you're really tested if you're going to go to the ballpark and you're going to be broadcasting for a team, especially in the month of September, which seems like it takes 30 years to play. You just can't wait to get that month over and take a big deep breath and look forward to the following season. But I'd say, aside from that, dealing with that type of situation that's not going to go away tomorrow, it's going to exist for the rest of the year. I felt like it was everything I thought it was going to be. I quite honestly feel like I was a part of an era where teams played exciting baseball. And I think gradually they're getting back to it now. That is stealing bases and going from first to third or second to home on a base hit. This club here in Cincinnati is leading the major leagues in stolen bases. All of a sudden, teams are waking up to the fact that, this might be a good idea to include as part of our arsenal, which they never have in the recent years because the game's been about home runs and strikeouts and walks. But it's a great, nobody had a better occupation than I did. I had the best job in the world. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been around it for 4.5 decades. I was truly put in a position where, one, I loved where I was living. And secondly, I loved the fact that I was going to the ballpark and broadcast baseball every night.
And they paid you to do it. What a gig, huh?
Pretty good, too.
Yeah. Any other questions that we have?
I actually had a question that you just answered, Marty, but I want you to elaborate a little bit more about when you're dealing with a losing franchise, which we know in Cincinnati over the last few years, maybe that's being a little bit generous. It's been a while since we've been really great.
Yes.
And how do you keep the hope alive for the fans who are tuning into the Cincinnati Reds specific broadcast? And how do you continue to establish important stakes that people care about when the team is clearly not where it should be?
Well, that's how you really have to work hard at your craft. I know today I don't go to the ballpark very much. I'll watch them on TV or listen on the radio when I'm home. And leading up to last season, when this team pretty much took the baseball world by surprise, somebody asked me on opening day of the 2023 season, they say, well, you in spring training, what do you think this club's record would be? And I said they'd be 68-92 or something like that. It was ridiculous. They ended up 82-80, and everybody couldn't wait to get a hold of me and say, hey, you really know a hell of a lot about baseball. That's a really good idea. But the year before that, a lot of conversation took place in the radio booth, and I'm sure they did in television also, of the young guys that were coming out of the minor leagues that were either playing in Dayton or playing in Louisville or Chattanooga, all the stops in the Reds farm system, that had a chance to really be impactful players. And that it's not going to give that you listening any hope about the current situation, but it does give you a feeling, a satisfied feeling that maybe if what they're saying is accurate, these guys are going to come up, a lot of them at the same time, and everything changes. And that's exactly what happened last year. They had the greatest group of talented young players in 2023 than I've ever seen. And they've carried that into 2024. That's really what you have to do. You have to keep your conversation light in the booth. You have to make people feel that even though they know how tough it is to broadcast a loser every night, at the same time, you got to make people think that there's not another place in the world that they'd rather be than at 7:10 when you start playing baseball and that game ends at whatever time it does. It's a tough job. If you have to do it year after year, I feel bad for the people in Pittsburgh because they don't show a whole lot of hope. They get their hopes up, and I'm just using them as an example. There are certainly other teams in that same situation. Thank God our people realized they had to do something, and they drafted well, they traded well, and the infrequent signing of a free agent player has pretty much gone well. But you got to work hard. That's the only way to make it happen, because you hope the next year will be a little bit different.
Before we start wrapping up, I wanted to ask you, Marty, about how the players have changed. I asked you how the game has changed and broadcasting has changed. How have the players changed? Because when you started and you talked about Pete and Johnny, and I mean, you all hung out together. You were, going out, you were having dinner, you ran together. And, we all read Ball 4 and we found out what happened on the road with some baseball teams and baseball players. But what is the difference between the player now and the player then? Are they more serious about their craft? Are they more concerned about their stats than the team? I mean, what do you see that differentiates the player now from the player maybe when you broke in?
Well, I think that I don't think they work any harder today than they did back then. I think the way they go about trying to become better players is different now from the way it used to be. It's more analytical. There's so many other modes of information that can help them. These guys have iPads in the dugout now, and they can go to the plate and strike out and walk right back to the dugout and turn the iPad on and watch pitch by pitch to find out where that at bat took a bad turn and he ended up striking out. You had nothing like that back in the day. Guys today come to spring training, they're in shape, because in the old days, there are a lot of guys that use spring training exactly in the context of the term, and that is to work their rear ends off to get in shape because they'd not done anything all winter. Not today. Normally, and I don't know about other ball clubs, but I know what ours does. The manager will meet with individual players the last 2 weeks of the season, and they'll talk about their year. And at some point, the manager will say, "This is the weight that we want you to report at next spring." It is a rare situation, and it's so rare that it becomes news if a key player on a club comes to camp grossly overweight because he didn't do anything in the off season. That doesn't happen anymore. Those guys are ready to play from a physical standpoint, not, hitting and all the other things that go into the game, but they're ready to play when they come to spring training. That was not the case back in the old days. And I think the players are probably a little bit closer in the sense that fraternity is an exclusive one. And when I was, early in the year in my career, when Pete and Joe Morgan and I would socialize on the road, broadcasters don't do that anymore. And I was told then, you can't do that. You can't afford to run with those guys financially. I liked them as people, and so I did go in one ear and out the other. And I don't think players would, as much as they might like a broadcaster, they don't like him enough to go out and have dinner with him and things of that nature. So I think they're closer as a group today than they might have been to some extent back in the old days. And again, I bring up the fact that social media, you don't want to be seen in a bar today and you've been overserved and you're not on top of your game, and you might do something stupid in a bar because inevitably somebody's going to take a picture of it. There is nothing that you can do to avoid that. And I think when that gradually crept into the consciousness of the baseball player industry, I think most of them were smart enough to realize whatever we did before, we can't do now. And because somebody is going to find you in an uncompromised situation, and now it's going to be very embarrassing. And I think that's been a good thing, because I think guys today, how do I put this? I think the guys today are much better rested when they go to the ballpark tomorrow night than they were in the old days, because of the things that they might have done then that they don't do now.
All right. And they want to protect their own brand. As you said, they want to make sure that they have their social media followers and they don't do anything that could hurt their next contract.
Correct.
So
Yes.
they have skin in the game, moving forward.
Yeah.
So as we wrap up, I always ask our guests to give the students some advice about next steps, how you prepare, what you look for, how you can make yourself the best prepared as you can be to take that next step once you graduate, to get that experience. So give us some advice on how the students can prepare to make sure that they are ready once they graduate.
Well, I think the biggest single thing, Betsy, is something we touched on earlier about the opportunities that exist for college students before they ever leave South Bend, Indiana. If they want to get involved, and the opportunity is in most cases available to you in whatever role you would like to one day serve professionally. The earlier, the better. I think, quite honestly, Jake's about as good an example as there is. I mean, he's worked in the Cape Cod League. He's done play-by-play. The more experience you can get, I think, on campus, it just puts you in that better position of finding something, because, today I think a lot of youngsters come out of college and they have experience, but the downside is that so many more today come out of college and they have experience. So you have to really work at it. I said a million times, I think getting into the business today, depending upon what role you want to play, certainly play-by-play and production, is as tough today as it was when I got a job. And I was blessed, and I had a lot of people working for me that made it a little bit easier and a little bit quicker for me to get where I wanted to be. But the experience factor is the single most important thing. The other thing, and I'm going to say this because I haven't been told that it's any different. It would be wonderful if there were clearinghouses for every position that there is to be involved in the broadcast business. There weren't when I came along, and I don't think there are today. Baseball has winter meetings every year in the fall after the World Series is normally in November. They move around to different cities, and a lot of guys show up.